The classroom buzzed with the usual chatter of students waiting for the final bell to ring. The air felt heavy with the anticipation of freedom, but one corner of the room radiated a different energy altogether. A boy sat hunched over his desk, his fingers moving frantically as he tried to salvage a science project he had poured weeks into. He was determined, even as the laughter and teasing from his classmates echoed around him. It wasn't uncommon for this boy to be the target of jokes. His reserved demeanor made him an easy mark. But today, he was too focused to care. At the front of the room, the teacher, a sharp-eyed man with an air of authority, was grading papers with precision. He was known for his strict methods, but also for his fairness. However, something about him seemed different today. His normally composed face carried an edge of tension, and his eyes darted occasionally to the boy working feverishly on his project. The boy's efforts drew more attention as the minutes passed. Whispers grew louder, punctuated by sneers and giggles. What's the point? The science fair's tomorrow, and that thing still looks like junk. One student teased, their voice loud enough to carry across the room. The boy kept his head down, his hands trembling as he adjusted wires and tightened screws. He couldn't afford to respond. His project wasn't just for the grade. It was his chance to prove he was more than the quiet kid everyone overlooked. The teacher's voice cut through the noise. "Settle down," he said, his tone calm but commanding. The room fell silent instantly, though the tension lingered. He glanced again at the boy, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something, but he turned his attention back to the papers in front of him instead. The final bell rang, and the students bolted from their seats, grabbing backpacks and shouting plans for the weekend. The boy stayed behind, carefully packing up his project. The teacher watched him from his desk, his sharp eyes narrowing. When the last of the students had left, he stood and walked to the boy's desk. "You've been working hard on this," the teacher said, his voice unusually soft. The boy looked up, startled, and nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The teacher leaned down, inspecting the project closely. "It's ambitious," he said, his tone neutral. "But ambition without preparation can lead to failure. Do you think this is ready?" The boy hesitated, his heart pounding. "I think it's close. I just need a little more time to finish it." The teacher straightened, his expression unreadable. "Time is a luxury you don't have. The fair is tomorrow, and presentations are in the morning." He paused, then added, "Sometimes, you have to know when to let go." The boy's stomach dropped. Was this his teacher's way of telling him his work wasn't good enough? He shook his head. "I can finish it," he said firmly. "I know I can." The teacher's lips twitched into something that could have been a smile, or perhaps a smirk. "We'll see," he said cryptically before turning back to his desk. The boy finished packing up and left the room, his heart heavy, but his resolve unshaken. The next morning, the gymnasium buzzed with excitement as students and parents filed in for the science fair. Tables were lined with projects of all shapes and sizes, some clearly more polished than others. The boy stood nervously by his own table, fidgeting with the final adjustments to his project. His father, the school principal, was making the rounds, offering encouraging words to students and keeping an eye on the event. The teacher entered the gym with his usual air of authority, but there was something almost predatory in the way he surveyed the room. He stopped at the boy's table, his sharp eyes narrowing as he inspected the project. "I see you've made some improvements," he said, his tone neutral. The boy nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. I worked all night to finish it." The teacher tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "It's a shame," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Sometimes, even the best efforts can be undermined by a single mistake." The boy's brows furrowed in confusion, but before he could ask what the teacher meant, his father appeared at the table. "Good morning," the principal said warmly. "How's it going here?" The teacher stepped back, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Quite well. Your son's project shows promise. I'm sure it will be an interesting presentation." The principal smiled proudly at his son, who managed a small, nervous smile in return. As the principal moved on to the next table, the teacher lingered for a moment longer, his eyes locking with the boys. Then, without another word, he walked away. The presentations began, each student nervously explaining their work to a panel of judges. The boy's turn came, and he stood before the panel, his hands shaking slightly as he began his demonstration. His project was a small, homemade generator, designed to power a light bulb using recycled materials. It wasn't flashy, but it was innovative and meticulously crafted. As he spoke, the teacher watched from the back of the room, his expression inscrutable. The boy's confidence grew as he explained the science behind his project, and by the time he flipped the switch to demonstrate its functionality, he felt a surge of pride. The light bulb flickered to life, and the audience murmured in appreciation. But then, something went wrong. The light bulb began to flicker erratically, and a faint smell of burning plastic filled the air. The boy's heart sank as he frantically tried to troubleshoot the issue, his mind racing. The judges exchanged concerned glances, and the audience began to murmur. The teacher stepped forward suddenly, his sharp eyes glinting. "It seems there's a problem," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. He reached out, his hand hovering over the project. "May I?" The boy hesitated, but before he could respond, the teacher picked up one of the components. His fingers moved deftly as he examined it, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tube of super glue. "What are you doing?" the boy asked, his voice rising in alarm. The teacher didn't answer. He applied a small amount of glue to the component and pressed it back into place. "There," he said, stepping back. "Try it now." The boy's hand shook as he flipped the switch again. The light bulb flickered once, then glowed steadily. The audience erupted into applause, but the boy felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Something about the teacher's intervention didn't sit right with him. As the event concluded, the boy packed up his project, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Why had the teacher intervened? And why had he been carrying super glue in the first place? Later that evening, the boy's father called him into his office. The principal's usually warm demeanor was replaced by a stern expression. "We need to talk about what happened at the science fair," he said, his voice steady but firm. The boy's heart pounded as he sat down. "What do you mean?" His father leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Your teacher's actions were unusual. I've received several complaints from other parents who found it inappropriate. I need to understand exactly what happened." The boy explained everything. The project, the problem, the teacher's sudden intervention. As he spoke, his father's expression darkened. When the boy finished, the principal sat back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't just about your project," he said finally. "It's about trust, professionalism, and boundaries. I'm going to have to look into this." The boy felt a chill run down his spine. He had always respected his teacher, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. And as his father began making phone calls, the boy couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? The boy sat quietly in his room, staring at the dismantled pieces of his science project. The applause from earlier still echoed in his mind, but it felt hollow now. Something about the way his teacher had intervened didn't make sense. Why had he stepped in so decisively? And why had he been so prepared, carrying super glue as if he'd expected something to go wrong? He replayed the scene in his head over and over, trying to spot something he might have missed. The teacher's calm demeanor, his cryptic words from the day before, and the deliberate way he had fixed the component. It all felt calculated. The boy's stomach twisted as he considered the possibility that the failure hadn't been accidental at all. Downstairs, his father was still on the phone, his voice firm as he spoke to someone from the school board. The boy strained to hear snippets of the conversation, but could only make out a few words. Inappropriate, incident, and investigation. His father rarely raised his voice, But there was an edge to his tone now that made the boy's chest tighten. This was serious. The next morning, the boy walked into school feeling a weight pressing down on him. Whispers seemed to follow him through the hallways, students glancing his way with curious or amused expressions. He couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if word about the science fair had spread, but he kept his head down and avoided making eye contact. When he reached his locker, a small group of classmates was already gathered nearby. "Hey," one of them said with a grin, "heard your project nearly blew up yesterday. Guess your teacher saved the day, huh?" The boy froze, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't like that," he mumbled, fumbling with his lock. Another student chimed in, their voice dripping with mock concern. "Oh, come on, we all saw it. If he hadn't stepped in, you'd have fried the whole gym. Maybe next time, let the adults handle it." Their laughter stung, but the boy forced himself to stay quiet. He grabbed his books and walked away quickly, their taunts fading into the background. As he rounded the corner, he nearly ran into his teacher, who was carrying a stack of papers. The teacher's sharp eyes flicked down to him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Good morning," the teacher said finally, his tone calm but cool. "Morning," the boy replied, avoiding his gaze. The teacher studied him for a moment longer, then said, "I hope you've had time to reflect on yesterday's events. It was a learning experience, if nothing else." The boy hesitated, then blurted out, "Why did you have super glue?" The question seemed to catch the teacher off guard, but only for a split second. "A teacher is always prepared," he said smoothly. "I carry supplies for all kinds of emergencies." The boy wanted to press further, but the teacher's expression made it clear the conversation was over. As he walked away, the boy felt more confused than ever. There was something about the teacher's calmness that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just confidence, it felt like control. Later that day, the principal called the boy into his office. The air felt heavy as the boy sat down across from his father, who looked more serious than the boy had ever seen him. "I've spoken to the teacher," his father began, folding his hands on the desk, "and I've reviewed the complaints from other parents. This situation is complicated." "What did he say?" the boy asked cautiously. "He insists he was acting in your best interest," his father replied. "He claims the glue was a necessary quick fix to prevent further damage to your project. But some of the details don't add up." His father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He knew too much about your project, details he shouldn't have known unless he had been closely observing you for weeks." The boy felt his chest tighten. "Do you think he sabotaged it?" he asked quietly. His father sighed. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's a possibility I can't ignore. There are rules about teacher-student boundaries, and if he crossed a line, we need to find out why." The boy's mind raced as he tried to process what his father was saying. If the teacher had sabotaged his project, what reason could he possibly have? Was it personal, or was there something bigger going on? Over the next few days, the tension at school only grew. The teacher seemed unfazed, going about his lessons as if nothing had happened. But the boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every glance from the teacher felt deliberate, every word carefully chosen. Meanwhile, his father's investigation continued quietly. The principal spoke to other students and staff, trying to piece together a clearer picture of the teacher's behavior. What emerged was a pattern, subtle but undeniable. The teacher had a history of getting too involved in certain students' work, often under the guise of helping. There were whispers of favoritism, of projects that mysteriously failed or succeeded under his guidance. One evening, the boy's father came home with a file in his hands. He sat down at the kitchen table, looking exhausted. "I've uncovered something," he said, his voice low. "It seems your teacher has a reputation for taking matters into his own hands. Some of his past students have described similar incidents, unexpected interventions, unexplained outcomes. It's not enough to prove wrongdoing, but it's troubling." The boy leaned forward, his heart pounding. What do we do now? His father shook his head. I've reported my findings to the school board. They'll decide whether to take further action. In the meantime, I want you to stay focused on your studies and avoid any unnecessary interaction with him. But staying focused was easier said than done. The boy couldn't stop thinking about the science fair, about the teacher's cryptic words and calculated actions. He began to notice other strange things, too. How the teacher's classroom door was always locked during lunch, how he carried a black notebook that he never let anyone see. The boy's curiosity grew, even as his unease deepened. One afternoon, after the final bell had rung and the hallways had emptied, the boy found himself standing outside the teacher's classroom. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the faint sound of papers rustling inside. His heart raced as he peeked through the gap, his curiosity battling with his fear. The teacher was sitting at his desk, the black notebook open in front of him. His sharp eyes scanned the pages intently, and his lips moved as if he were muttering to himself. The boy couldn't make out what he was saying, but the intensity of his focus was unsettling. Suddenly, the teacher looked up, his eyes locking onto the boy's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the teacher smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. "Can I help you?" the teacher asked, his tone deceptively polite. The boy froze, his mind racing for an excuse. I forgot my book," he stammered. "I thought I left it in here." The teacher's smile didn't falter. "Come in and look, then." The boy hesitated, then stepped into the room, his eyes darting around for any sign of his supposed book. The black notebook was still on the desk, its pages filled with handwriting too small for him to read. The teacher watched him closely, his sharp eyes glinting with something that might have been amusement. When the boy finally left the room, his hands were trembling. He didn't know what the teacher was writing in that notebook, but he was certain it wasn't anything good. The mystery was growing deeper, and the boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of it. As he walked home that day, his mind swirled with questions. Why had the teacher been watching him so closely? What was in that notebook? And most importantly, what was the teacher's endgame? The answers felt just out of reach, but the boy knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this go, not until he uncovered the truth. The boy couldn't stop thinking about the teacher's unsettling smile. That moment, when their eyes locked, felt like more than just an accident. It was as if the teacher had known he was watching, as if the entire encounter had been planned. The boy was sure of one thing now. He was being drawn into something much larger than a simple classroom disagreement. But what? That night, he barely slept. His mind raced, tossing and turning with ideas and theories. The super glue, the teacher's sudden intervention, the locked door. It was all connected. But how? And why was the teacher so intent on keeping him involved in his project? The next day, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't just wait for his father's investigation to unfold. The boy needed to find out what was really going on. He had to know what the teacher was hiding. During lunch break, he made his way back to the science lab. The hallway was quiet, with most students gathered in the cafeteria or outside. He knew he was taking a risk, but this was his chance. The door to the lab was ajar again, just like before. He peered inside, heart racing, but the teacher wasn't there. He slipped into the room quickly, trying to move as quietly as possible. His eyes scanned the desk where the teacher had been sitting the day before. The black notebook was still there, and the boy could see it clearly now, its pages filled with dense writing. He stepped closer, his hands shaking as he reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the notebook, a noise startled him. The teacher's voice called from the hallway, and the boy's heart leaped into his throat. He quickly pulled his hand back, his body frozen in place. "Who's there?" The teacher's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. The boy's mind raced, but before he could think of an excuse, the door opened slowly. The teacher stood there, his gaze piercing, a slight frown on his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice measured, but there was a hint of something colder beneath the surface. The boy tried to force a smile, his stomach in knots. I forgot something," he stammered, backing away from the desk. "I thought it was in here." The teacher stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the boy. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately," he remarked, his tone casual but somehow threatening. The boy swallowed hard, unable to think of a response. The tension in the room felt suffocating, and he was certain the teacher could sense his unease. The teacher's smile returned, but this time it didn't seem reassuring. It was almost predatory. "You know," the teacher said, "sometimes curiosity can be dangerous, especially when it leads you to places you're not meant to be." The boy's mind raced, but before he could reply, the teacher walked past him toward the desk. He reached for the notebook and slid it into the drawer, locking it with a small click. "I suggest you focus on your own work," he said, his voice low. "We wouldn't want another incident." The boy's pulse raced. The teacher was warning him, but was it a threat or just a statement of fact? The teacher had known exactly what he was doing, and now the boy knew he was tangled in something dangerous. But what was the teacher really after? What was in that notebook? The teacher's footsteps echoed as he left the room, but the boy stayed frozen for a long moment, his heart hammering in his chest. The room felt colder now, emptier. He knew he couldn't back out. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. He had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The next few days felt like an endless game of cat and mouse. The boy watched the teacher closely, but the man never let his guard down. His presence was always just a little too calculated, as if he could sense the boy's every move. And yet there was still no clear answer to the mystery. Every time the boy thought he was getting closer to the truth, something happened to throw him off course. One afternoon, as the boy sat in the library, he overheard two students talking in hushed tones. Their conversation caught his attention, and he strained to hear their words. "I heard he's been meeting with the principal a lot lately," one student whispered. "They're saying the teacher's been acting strange, more secretive." "Yeah," the other student replied. "And some of the other teachers are starting to notice. They think something's going on. I mean, he always seemed a little off, but now it's like he's got something to hide." The boy's heart skipped a beat. The teacher was meeting with the principal. That didn't make sense. Was the principal involved in this somehow? The boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was only scratching the surface of a much bigger mystery. Later that night, the boy sat down with his father to talk. His father was still working late, going over the reports and notes from the investigation. The boy hesitated, unsure whether to mention what he had learned, but he knew he couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Dad," the boy began, his voice barely a whisper, "I think I know something." The teacher, "He's hiding something. He's been acting weird, and I think he's involved with something bigger than just a science project." His father didn't look up at first, his focus entirely on the papers in front of him. "What do you mean?" he asked, finally glancing up with a serious expression. "The teacher's been meeting with the principal a lot," the boy said. "And I heard some rumors. People think he's hiding something. He's been manipulating things, I think, trying to control the situation." The father's eyes narrowed as he put down his pen. "I've been investigating this for weeks. There's something strange going on, but I haven't been able to prove it yet. Your teacher might be a part of something larger, something that involves the school board. I'm still trying to piece it all together." The boy's mind raced. "What do you think he wants?" His father didn't answer right away, his face creased in thought. "I don't know yet, but whatever it is, it's bigger than you or me, and we have to be careful. If you're right, he might not be working alone." A chill ran down the boy's spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about a ruined science project anymore. It was about power, control, and secrets that could shatter everything. The boy couldn't sleep that night. The tension had built to a breaking point, and he knew that the next step would determine everything. He had to find a way to confront the teacher, to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. But what if the teacher had already planned for this? What if he was expecting the boy to make a move? The boy was about to find out. Tomorrow, he would take the biggest risk of all. He couldn't back down now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The next morning, the boy arrived at school with a sense of determination tempered by fear. He had no concrete plan, just a gut feeling that he had to act now before the opportunity slipped away. As he walked through the halls, the normal buzz of students and teachers seemed distant, like a muted backdrop to the storm building in his mind. Every sound, every face, every glance felt charged with meaning, as if the entire school was holding its breath. The science lab felt colder than usual when he entered, and his footsteps echoed unnervingly in the empty space. His eyes darted to the teacher's desk, but the black notebook was gone. For a moment, he wondered if it had been moved or hidden elsewhere, but a faint hum from the back of the room pulled his attention. The storage closet door was slightly ajar, and light seeped out from the gap. The boy's breath caught. He had never seen anyone use the storage room for anything other than extra equipment. He crept closer, his pulse quickening with each step. Peeking through the crack, he saw the teacher bent over a device unlike anything he had ever seen before. It glowed faintly, its surface sleek and metallic, humming with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The teacher's hands moved with precision, adjusting small dials and buttons while muttering words the boy couldn't make out. This wasn't normal science equipment. It looked like something out of a high-tech lab or even a sci-fi movie. The boy's stomach churned as the reality of what he was witnessing began to sink in. Whatever this device was, it had nothing to do with their curriculum. This was something secret, something the teacher had gone to great lengths to hide. Before the boy could make sense of it, the teacher suddenly froze, his head tilting slightly as if he had sensed someone watching. The boy ducked back behind the door, his heart pounding in his ears. "Who's there?" the teacher called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The boy held his breath, pressing himself against the wall. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of the device. Then the door creaked open, and the teacher stepped into the lab, his eyes scanning the room. The boy's mind raced. If he was caught now, there would be no talking his way out of it. He would have to run. But his legs felt frozen in place. The teacher's gaze lingered near the spot where he was hiding, and for a terrifying moment, their eyes almost met. But then, a voice echoed from the hallway. "Mr. Hartwell." It was another teacher, calling out from down the corridor. The boy didn't recognize the voice, but the interruption was enough. The teacher hesitated, then turned away, heading toward the door. The boy took the chance to slip out, his movements as silent as he could make them. His heart raced as he darted into an adjacent hallway, finally allowing himself to breathe once he was out of sight. Whatever the teacher was working on, it was clear now that it wasn't just a strange hobby or personal project. This was bigger than anything the boy had imagined. The rest of the day passed in a haze. He couldn't focus in class, couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. The glowing device, the teacher's urgency, the way he had reacted. It all pointed to something dangerous, something that could have serious consequences. But what was it for? And why was the teacher so intent on keeping it hidden? That evening, the boy decided to tell his father everything. He couldn't keep this to himself anymore. If anyone could figure out what was going on, it was his dad. He waited until dinner, when the two of them were alone in the kitchen. "Dad," he began, his voice shaky but firm, "I saw something today. Something weird in the science lab. The teacher, he was working on this machine, and it didn't look like anything we've ever used in class. It was glowing, and it made this sound. I don't know what it was, but it felt wrong." His father's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, listening intently. "What do you mean, a machine? What did it look like?" The boy did his best to describe it, though the details were still hazy in his mind. His father's face grew more serious with every word, and when the boy finished, He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "This might be bigger than we thought," his father muttered, almost to himself. "I've been hearing whispers about unauthorized experiments, equipment going missing from storage rooms, even strange reports from staff. But no one could pinpoint who was behind it. If it's your teacher." The boy's stomach dropped. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His father turned to him, his expression grim but determined. "We need proof. If this is what I think it is, we can't confront him without evidence. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk to the school board. In the meantime, stay away from him. Don't give him any reason to suspect you know anything." But staying away wasn't an option. The boy couldn't let it go. Not now. That night, as he lay in bed, he made a decision. He had to go back. He had to see the machine again, to figure out what it was and why the teacher was so desperate to hide it. The next day, he waited until after school, lurking in the hallways until most of the students had gone home. The lab was empty when he arrived, but the storage closet door was locked this time. The boy's heart sank. He hadn't thought of this possibility. As he stood there, wondering what to do, he noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to be coming from the floor beneath him. He crouched down, pressing his hand to the tiles, and felt it more clearly. It was rhythmic, almost like a pulse, and it seemed to be coming from beneath the lab itself. His mind raced with possibilities. Was the machine even larger than he had realized? Was it connected to something hidden below the school? The idea sent a chill down his spine, but it also solidified his resolve. He had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. As he turned to leave, a voice stopped him cold. "Looking for something?" The teacher stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp and calculating. The boy froze, his mind scrambling for an explanation. But before he could speak, the teacher stepped closer, closing the door behind him. "You're very curious, aren't you?" the teacher said, his tone almost mocking. "Curiosity can be a good thing, but only if you know when to stop." The boy's pulse thundered in his ears as the teacher reached into his pocket, pulling out a key. He held it up for a moment before unlocking the storage closet door. "Since you're so interested," the teacher said, pushing the door open, "why don't you see for yourself?" The boy hesitated, fear and curiosity warring within him. But the teacher's smile didn't waver, and his voice carried a note of challenge. "Go on," he said. "You wanted answers, didn't you?" The boy stepped forward, his heart pounding, and peered inside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Inside the storage closet, the boy's eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. The device he had seen earlier was now fully assembled, its glow pulsating more intensely. Strange symbols ran across its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves like living letters. The air around it felt charged, almost electric, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. But what truly froze him in place was the faint shimmer of something forming above the device, a flickering, translucent image that seemed to ripple like water. It was almost like a portal, though to where, he couldn't begin to guess. The teacher stepped in behind him, the door clicking shut. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of menace. "This is what curiosity leads to: discovery, innovation, and sometimes danger." The boy turned to face him, his voice trembling but resolute. "What is this? Why are you doing this?" The teacher tilted his head, studying him like a puzzle. "You wouldn't understand, but let's just say that some of us have bigger ambitions than this tiny school. Bigger plans than you or your father could ever imagine." His tone sharpened, the mask of patience slipping. "But you had to meddle. You couldn't leave well enough alone." The boy's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. "My dad knows," he blurted out, hoping to buy time. "He's going to the school board. They'll figure this out, and you won't get away with it." The teacher's expression darkened. For a moment, he said nothing, but then he laughed. a cold, mirthless sound that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. Your father might think he has power here, but he's just another cog in the machine. By the time anyone figures out what's happening, it will be too late. Before the boy could react, the teacher moved to the device, his fingers dancing across the controls. The hum grew louder, the light brighter, and the flickering image above the machine began to solidify. The boy's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Then, without warning, the portal burst to life, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The boy shielded his eyes from the intensity of it, but when he glanced back, he saw something emerge from the other side. Something tall, cloaked in shimmering armor that seemed to shift and blend with the light. Its presence was overwhelming, radiating an aura of power and danger. "What is that?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the portal. The teacher didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, bowing slightly to the figure. "I've done as instructed," he said, his tone deferential. "The device is ready. The gateway is stable. Soon, the rest of your kind will follow." The figure spoke, though its voice was more a vibration than a sound, resonating in the boy's chest. The words were incomprehensible, but their intent was clear: approval, followed by a command. The teacher nodded, his movements quick and precise as he began adjusting the machine again. The boy's panic reached its breaking point. Whatever was happening, it couldn't be good. He had to stop it, but how? He glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. It wasn't much, but it was something. Summoning every ounce of courage, he grabbed the extinguisher and charged toward the device. The teacher noticed too late, his shout of protest drowned out by the boy's determined cry. Swinging the extinguisher with all his strength, the boy struck the machine, sparks flying as the delicate components shattered. The effect was immediate. The portal flickered violently, the figure on the other side reaching out as if to stabilize it. But the damage was done. The light dimmed, the vortex collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. The figure let out a sound, part rage, part despair, before vanishing as the portal winked out of existence. The teacher spun toward the boy, his face a mask of fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted, advancing on him. But before he could reach him, the door to the lab burst open. It was the boy's father, flanked by two other adults who appeared to be members of the school board. Their expressions shifted from confusion to shock as they took in the scene: the destroyed machine, the singed marks on the floor, and the teacher, caught red-handed. "Step away from him," the boy's father commanded, his voice firm and unyielding. The teacher hesitated, then slowly raised his hands, his face twisting in frustration and defeat. The boy stumbled back, relief washing over him as his father pulled him into a protective embrace. "Are you okay?" his father asked, his voice tight with worry. The boy nodded, though his legs felt like jelly. I think so." As the school board members began questioning the teacher, the boy's father led him out of the room. But even as they walked away, the boy couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. The machine was destroyed, the portal closed, but the figure on the other side, and the teacher's cryptic words, left him with more questions than answers. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the portal, the figure, the strange, shifting light. He couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Or had he only delayed something far bigger than he could understand? Just as he began to drift off, a faint hum reached his ears. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The same rhythmic vibration he had felt beneath the lab floor. And it was coming from beneath his house. The boy bolted upright in bed, his ears straining to pick up the faint hum beneath the floor. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, an echo of the chaos in the lab. But as the sound grew clearer, His chest tightened. It wasn't his imagination. He crept out of bed, careful not to wake his parents. The house was silent except for the hum, its faint vibration sending chills through him. He made his way to the basement door, his heart pounding with every step. Slowly, he opened it, the creak of the hinges startlingly loud in the stillness. The hum was louder now, resonating in the cool, musty air. The basement was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through a small, dirty window. He descended the stairs cautiously, each creak of the wooden steps making him flinch. When he reached the bottom, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. At the far end of the basement, beneath an old rug, the faintest outline of a symbol glowed. It was the same symbol he had seen on the device in the lab, shifting and rearranging itself in a hypnotic dance. The boy froze, unsure whether to approach or run. But something compelled him forward, a mix of fear and curiosity propelling his feet across the cold cement floor. As he knelt to touch the glowing mark, a voice from behind startled him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. His father stood at the top of the stairs, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the dim light. His expression was unreadable, a mix of concern and something else the boy couldn't quite place. "Dad," the boy stammered, "do you hear it? Do you see this?" His father descended the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't answer until he was standing beside the boy, staring down at the glowing mark. "I hoped this wouldn't happen," he muttered, almost to himself. The boy blinked, confused. "What do you mean? What is this?" His father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want you involved in any of this. You weren't supposed to find out. But after what happened today, there's no point in hiding it anymore." The boy's stomach churned as he looked up at his father. "Hiding what? You knew about this." His father crouched down, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not everything, but enough to know this is dangerous. That teacher, he wasn't acting alone. There are others, people who've been searching for these gateways for years. They're remnants of something ancient, something we don't fully understand. And they're not meant to be opened." The boy's mind raced, struggling to process the revelation. So the portal in the lab was connected to this. His father nodded grimly. "When you destroyed the machine, it severed the connection. But whatever power activated it in the first place didn't just disappear. It found another way to manifest. Here." The boy stared at the glowing mark, his fear growing with every passing second. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" His father hesitated, then stood, his jaw set with determination. "We seal it. For good. But I'll need your help." Together, they worked quickly. His father retrieved tools and materials from the garage, while the boy stayed by the glowing mark, the hum growing louder as if sensing their intent. They reinforced the basement floor, layering it with metal and concrete, then covering it with insulation and heavy bolts. All the while, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, an unseen presence lurking just beyond his perception. When they finished, the glow had faded and the hum was gone. But the boy knew it wasn't truly over. His father confirmed as much when he sat him down later that night. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," his father explained, his tone serious. "And it won't be the last. These gateways, they're scattered all over the world, hidden in places people least expect. Some people want to use them for power, for control. Others, like that teacher, think they're helping something greater. But the truth is, no one really knows what's on the other side." The boy nodded, the weight of the night settling heavily on his shoulders. "But why us? Why is this happening here?" His father smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes we don't get to choose the role we play. We just do our best with what we're given. You were brave tonight, and because of that, you stopped something terrible from happening." The boy didn't feel brave. He felt small, like a single thread in a vast, incomprehensible web. But his father's words stayed with him, a quiet reassurance that his actions had mattered. In the days that followed, life at school returned to a strange normalcy. The teacher was dismissed, though the official story claimed it was due to unrelated misconduct. The lab was shut down for renovations, its mysterious equipment removed and replaced with standard-issue supplies. Most of the students didn't seem to notice or care, too preoccupied with their own lives to question the abrupt changes. But the boy noticed. He noticed the way his father seemed more watchful, his gaze lingering on shadows and empty hallways. He noticed the way the basement felt different, quieter but heavier, as if the sealed gateway still pulsed beneath the layers of concrete and metal. He tried to move on, to focus on his studies and his friends, but the events of that night stayed with him. He found himself researching symbols and ancient myths, digging into obscure books and online forums in search of answers. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. Fragmented stories of gateways and otherworldly beings, of power and chaos beyond human comprehension. One evening, as he sat in his room, poring over a particularly dense article, his father knocked on the door. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the scattered papers and open laptop. The boy shrugged, unsure how to explain his need to understand. I don't want to be caught off guard again." His father smiled, this time with genuine warmth. "That's good. But remember, you're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The boy nodded, a flicker of relief easing the tension in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm, as if the world was settling back into place. But as the night stretched on, and the house grew quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere, in the shadows of the world, other gateways waited. Other forces moved, and though he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he would be ready. The story of the glowing mark in the basement, the swirling portal, and the mysterious figure from beyond remained a secret between him and his father. But it became more than just a memory. It became a reminder. A reminder that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing firm in the face of the unknown and choosing to act, no matter how small or insignificant that act might seem. As the boy drifted off to sleep that night, the faint hum of the world around him was just that, a hum. Peaceful, steady, and for now, without menace.